The most expensive sound in the world isn't a supercar engine or a private jet. It's the sound of silence in a room full of people who have just seen the unspeakable. For Elena Landon, that sound was the deafening echo of her husband's hand striking her face at the most public event of the year. Mark Landon was a god in this city, a man who commanded boardrooms and headlines. But as he stood over his wife, his face a mask of rage. He had no idea that his entire world was about to end. He thought he had all the power. He thought the police walking through the door were for her. He was wrong. And when he finally saw who was walking with them, his collapse was absolute. This is the story of how a single hidden act of courage brought down an empire of lies. The Landon estate in the Palisades wasn't a home. It was a statement. A sprawling 10,000 square foot monument of glass white marble and cold ocean-facing minimalism, it was designed to be admired, not lived in. For Elena Hayes Landon, it was the most beautiful prison in California. From the outside, her life was an object of profound envy. She was the elegant, reserved wife of Mark Landon, the charismatic, self-made CEO of Landon Corp., a private equity firm that had in 10 short years devoured its competition. Mark was all teeth charm and ambition. He was the man on the cover of Forbes and Fortune, the new titan of Los Angeles. Elena, with her old money grace and quiet poise, was the perfect accessory. She was the Hayes, as in Hayes Holdings, the industrial giant her grandfather had built and her father Arthur Hayes now commanded. The marriage had been called the merger of the decade by the society pages. But inside the glass fortress, the merger was a hostile takeover. The blue Elena. I told you the sapphire dress, not the emerald. Elena stood motionless in their cavernous walk-in closet the size of a studio apartment. The emerald silk dress was a soft, deep green, a color that brought out the warmth in her eyes. She had for a fleeting, foolish moment chosen it for herself. Mark didn't even look up from his phone where he was scrolling through market reports. He was already in his custom tuxedo, the black wool seeming to absorb the light in the room. The sapphire matches the branding for the gala. Future forward. It's all blues and silvers. The green makes you look sallow. Are you ill? No, Mark. I like this one. Her voice was a whisper, a bad habit she'd developed over the last 5 years. Speaking at a normal volume often felt like a provocation. Now he looked up. His eyes, a piercing gray, scanned her from head to toe. It wasn't a look of appreciation. It was an inventory. You liked it. He repeated the words flat and cold. And did you like that it pulls just a bit across the hips? Mrs. Davenport will be there. She's skeletal. I'll give her that, but she's always put together. This is sloppy. It suggests you've been skipping your sessions with Taryn. Elena's stomach tightened. Taryn was the personal trainer Mark paid an obscene amount of money to ensure his wife maintained the lines he required. I haven't, she said, her hands clenching the silk. I'll change. Good. He went back to his phone. The car's here in 30. Don't smudge your makeup this time. That crying thing you do is pathetic. He walked out, leaving her alone in the cold, bright closet. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger, a pale, thin creature with haunted eyes draped in a dress she despised. This was the night. The Landon Corp Future Forward Gala at the Sinclair Hotel. It was Mark's coronation. He had just closed a massive deal with Vance Capital, and tonight was about cementing his status not just as a player, but as the player. For Elena, it was something else entirely. It was the deadline. She carefully took off the green dress, folded it, and put it back in its drawer, a tiny act of defiance to keep it safe. She pulled out the sapphire dress. It was beautiful, a column of glittering ice blue beads. It fit her perfectly, just as Mark knew it would. It was also cold, heavy, and restrictive. It was a cage made of fabric. As she zipped it up, her hand brushed against the small, hard outline in her clutch, a simple, encrypted USB drive. Mark was stressed more than usual. He'd been snapping for weeks. his nights filled with pacing in his home office, his voice a low, angry murmur on calls he took on the terrace far from her hearing. He'd blamed it on a routine audit at Hayes Holdings, her father's company. "Your father's dinosaur accountants," he'd scoffed just last week. "They're buried in paperwork, can't find their own feet. It's just red tape, but it's my time they're wasting. I'm practically running that division for him as a favor, and this is the thanks I get." Elena had just nodded, her heart hammering a frantic silent rhythm against her ribs. She knew about the audit. She knew it wasn't routine, because she was the one who had triggered it. She put on the diamond necklace Mark had gifted her, a beautiful heavy collar. She looked at the woman in the mirror again. The dress was perfect. Her makeup was flawless. Her expression was serene. She was the perfect porcelain doll. And tonight, she was going to bring the whole dollhouse down. 5 years ago, Elena Hayes had been a different person. She was quiet, yes, but it was a thoughtful quiet, not a frightened one. She worked in art curation, specializing in post-war European sculpture. She had her own apartment in West Hollywood, her own friends, her own life. Her father, Arthur Hayes, was a powerful man, but he was also a kind one, and he had always encouraged her independence. Then came Mark Landon. He was a force of nature. He'd burst into her life at a gallery opening, all dazzling charm and relentless energy. He wasn't like the staid, predictable, old money boys she'd grown up with. He was ambitious, exciting, and he saw her. He didn't talk down to her. He listened, or so it seemed. He'd called her his still water, the calm center to his storm. Arthur Hayes had despised him on sight. "He's not real, Elena," Arthur had told her over dinner at Musso and Frank, his favorite old-world haunt. It was one of the few times she'd ever seen her father truly angry. "He's a performance. He doesn't look at you. He assesses you. He doesn't love you. He loves what you represent. The Hayes name is the one thing he can't buy." Elena, blinded by what she thought was love, had accused him of being a snob. The fight had been terrible, creating a rift between them that had never truly healed. A year later, she was Elena Hayes Landon, and the performance Arthur had warned her about began to fade. It started small. He simplified her life. Her art curation job was a cute hobby, but unnecessary. Her friends were shallow, or had a bad influence. Her car was not secure enough. Slowly, methodically, he had replaced her world with his. First, her phone. He upgraded her to a new one, all part of the Landon Corp family plan managed by his IT department for security. Then her finances. "Why are you bothering with your own accounts, darling? It's inefficient. Let my finance team handle everything. It's all our money now, isn't it?" Her allowance was generous, but it was just that, an allowance. She, a 30-year-old woman, had to ask her husband for money, which was then logged by his assistant. The verbal digs became a daily erosion. Her opinions were naive. Her education was ornamental. Her family was stuck in the past. Then 6 months ago, the first time he'd laid a hand on her. It wasn't a slap. It was a warning. He'd grabbed her wrist during an argument about her talking to her father, his father-in-law, at a charity brunch. He'd grabbed her so hard his fingers had left 4 distinct purple-black bruises that bloomed the next day. He had apologized, of course, cried even. He was under so much pressure. He didn't know his own strength. He would never hurt her. Elena, staring at the marks, had finally seen the performance her father had warned her about. The mask had slipped and the monster was real. That was the day her secret life began. She'd arranged a meeting with her one remaining friend, Sarah Jenkins, a lawyer she'd known since undergrad. They met at the Bluebird Cafe, a small, unassuming place in a neighborhood Mark would never visit. Elena, my God! Sarah's eyes had gone wide when Elena, her hand shaking, pulled back the sleeve of her cashmere sweater. "He said it was an accident," Elena whispered, the shame a hot rock in her throat. Sarah's face, usually so warm, turned to ice. "That's not an accident, Elena. That's a preview. What do you want to do?" I can't just leave. He controls everything. The house, the accounts. He tracks my phone, my car. He'd ruin me. He'd ruin my family. He'd call my father a failure. He'd say I was unstable. I have nothing. You have me, Sarah said, her voice fierce. And you have your father. You have to tell him. No, not yet. Not about this. Elena couldn't bear the thought of her father knowing she'd been physically hurt. The guilt of ignoring his warning was too great. But I think he's doing something else. Something wrong. And she told Sarah about Mark's late-night calls. About the creative accounting he'd boasted about after a few too many scotches. About the way he'd been shifting assets, creating shell companies, and bragging about how he was running circles around her father's dinosaur board at Hayes Holdings. Mark had been put in charge of the Hayes Foundation, the family's charitable wing, as a goodwill gesture. Mark had sneered that it was idiot's work, but he'd taken to it with a strange secretive fervor. I think he's stealing, Sarah, Elena whispered. Not just from investors. I think he's stealing from my family. Sarah's legal mind snapped into focus. Domestic abuse is hard to prove, Elena. He'll gaslight you, paint you as a bitter, unstable wife. But fraud, embezzlement, that's paper. That's a trail. That's prison. So the plan was born. Elena couldn't get into his corporate servers. But she didn't need to. Mark, in his supreme arrogance, believed she was too stupid to understand his business. He left his home office laptop unlocked. He took calls on speaker. He left documents on his desk. For 6 months, Elena had become a ghost in her own home. While Mark slept, she photographed documents with a burner phone Sarah had given her. While he was in the shower, she slipped the encrypted USB drive into his laptop, downloading file structures, spreadsheets, and offshore account numbers. She found it all. The Hayes Foundation account, meant to be building hospitals in developing countries, was a phantom. The money was being routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands, Landon Global Initiatives, and then directly into a private numbered account in Zurich. He wasn't just stealing. He was using her family's charity as his personal piggy bank, laundering money. He was also siphoning from Hayes Holdings itself, using the access she had given him as a favor. 2 months ago, she had given the USB drive to her father. Not at his office, but at a public park, like a spy in a cheap thriller. Arthur Hayes had looked at the data, his face pale, his hands shaking with a silent volcanic rage. He had looked at his daughter, truly seen her for the first time in years, not as a victim but as a soldier. He hadn't asked about the bruises. He didn't need to. He finally understood. I will handle this, Elena, he'd said, his voice thick. The audit is just the start. I'm hiring a private forensic team. When this is done, he will be done. And tonight was the night. The gala, a celebration of Mark's philanthropy through the Hayes Foundation, was the final arrogant insult. It was, as Elena had discovered, his exit event, a night to solicit one last round of massive donations before he dissolved. The foundation moved the money and likely left the country with her or without her. She finished her makeup. The woman in the mirror looked back, her eyes as cold and blue as the dress. The car is here. Mark's voice boomed from the foyer. Now, Elena. She picked up her tiny beaded clutch, the USB drive now empty, a decoy safely tucked inside. She walked down the marble staircase, a perfect porcelain wife gliding toward her husband. He didn't look at her. He just held out his arm, his eyes already on the door, already on his adoring public. She took his arm, her gloved hand resting on the expensive wool of his jacket, and she smiled. The Sinclair Hotel's grand ballroom was a spectacle of deliberate, overwhelming opulence. 3-story-high ceilings were draped in silver and midnight blue silk. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, cast a diamond-like glitter over the 300 guests. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved silently through the throng, balancing trays of champagne and caviar blinis. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner, a smooth, expensive sound that served as auditory wallpaper. This was Mark Landon's stage. He was magnificent on it. He moved through the crowd not as a man, but as a current. People parted for him then, were drawn into his wake. He clasped shoulders, flashed his predator-white smile, and accepted the congratulations that flowed toward him like a river. Mark, incredible quarter. Just incredible. That Vance deal, Mark, a masterstroke. The Hayes Foundation, what you're doing is just wonderful. Truly. Elena was tethered to his arm, smiling until her cheeks ached. She was the picture of the adoring, supportive wife. She laughed at the appropriate times. She nodded, her diamond collar flashing as Mark accepted praise for the charity work she had the spreadsheets for. "Oh, it's all Elena, really," Mark said to Mr. and Mrs. Davenport, a banking couple with old-world influence. He squeezed her hand, a gesture that looked affectionate but was, as Elena knew, a command to perform. "She has the good heart. I'm just the numbers guy." "You're too modest, Mark," gushed Amelia Davenport, her bony fingers clutching a champagne flute. "And Elena, dear, that dress is simply divine. You look like a princess." "Thank you, Amelia," Elena said, her voice smooth. Mark picked it out. He has such an eye for detail. Mark beamed, accepting the compliment as his due. He steered them toward the main bar where his chief rival Richard Vance was holding court. Vance, the CEO of Vance Capital, was older, sharper, and had been openly skeptical of Mark's golden boy reputation. The deal they'd just closed had been contentious. "Richard, glad you could make it," Mark boomed, clapping the other man on the back. Richard Vance turned his eyes cool and appraising. "Mark, impressive party. You're certainly celebrating." "We celebrate integrity, Richard," Mark said, his voice dropping to a confidential, earnest tone. "That's what the Hayes Foundation is all about. It's not just about profit. It's about legacy, giving back." Elena felt a surge of nausea so profound she thought she might be sick on the marble floor. He was practicing his speech. "Of course," Vance said, his gaze shifting to Elena. There was no artifice in his look, just a quiet, almost sad curiosity. "Mrs. Landon, a pleasure to see you again. You were at the LA Opera opening last month, weren't you? I was sorry we didn't get a chance to speak." Before Elena could reply, Mark cut in. "Elena's been fully consumed with the foundation. She's my secret weapon, aren't you, darling?" He kissed her on the temple, a public branding. "I was," Elena said, her voice clear and carrying just slightly louder than she normally dared. Mark's hand on her arm tightened. She turned her body slightly, a subtle but deliberate untangling from her husband, and faced Richard Vance directly. "I was at the opera, Mr. Vance. I thought the new production of Salome was ambitious. Perhaps a little overwrought in the third act, but the staging was brilliant." Vance's eyebrows lifted in genuine surprise. Mark had always portrayed his wife as a beautiful simpleton. "You're a critic, then?" "I used to curate," Elena said, a small, real smile touching her lips. "Post-war sculpture. But I find all art fascinating. Don't you think the parallels between the financial world's creative destruction and the post-war art movement are compelling?" Mark was staring at her. His smile was still plastered on his face, but his eyes had gone flat and cold. He was not just surprised, he was furious. She was not performing her role. She was having an actual intelligent conversation. She was in his mind showing off. She was stealing his spotlight. Richard Vance was captivated. "I've never thought of it that way. That's a fascinating point, Mrs. Landon. We at Vance Capital have a new arts endowment. Perhaps you'd be willing to consult?" "I would be very interested," Elena said. Just as the lights in the ballroom dimmed, and a single spotlight hit the main stage. "Ah, showtime!" Mark hissed, his fingers digging into her arm so hard she winced. He pulled her none too gently toward their front row table. As they sat, he leaned in, his breath hot and sour with champagne. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "I was networking," she whispered back, her face a serene mask for the rest of the room. "You were undermining me," he snarled. "Flirting with him, making me look like an idiot. You are an accessory, Elena. You are not the main event. Don't you ever forget that again." His name was called. The applause was thunderous. Mark stood up, adjusted his tuxedo, and that $1,000,000 smile was back, blinding and false. He walked onto the stage, the conquering hero. Elena sat perfectly still, her hands in her lap, her heart a cold, heavy stone. She watched him walk into the light. Mark's speech was a masterpiece of narcissistic hypocrisy. He spoke of trust, transparency, and family. He spoke of his wonderful father-in-law, Arthur Hayes, and his wisdom. He spoke of the sacred duty of the wealthy to give back. And he spoke of his beautiful, supportive wife, his anchor, his inspiration. This foundation, he said, his voice thick with fake emotion, is our shared dream. And I pledge to you tonight, as we look to the future forward, that we will not rest. We will not stop. We will change the world. He raised his glass. To the future. To the future. The crowd echoed, rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Mark stood there bathing in the applause, his arms spread wide. Elena stood up with them. She did not clap. She simply watched him. He caught her eye from the stage, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He saw her expressionless face. He knew she had defied him, and he knew there would be a price. As he walked off the stage, basking in the glow, he made a beeline for her. The jazz quartet swelled and the chatter resumed. He grabbed her arm. "We need to talk," he said, his voice a low growl. "Yes, Mark," she said. "We do." "Not here." He began to pull her not toward the exit, but toward the glass doors leading to the hotel's private terrace. "We are going to have a discussion about respect." Elena did not resist. She let him pull her through the crowd, past the smiling, oblivious faces of the Davenports and the curious stare of Richard Vance. She let him lead her out into the cold night air. The final act was about to begin. The terrace was a wide stone expanse overlooking the glittering, indifferent sprawl of Los Angeles. It was separated from the ballroom by a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass insulating the party from the city noise and vice versa. It was less private than a back room. Anyone who cared to look out the window could see them framed like actors on a silent stage. This was deliberate. Mark's rages were not always for privacy. They were for control. He wanted her to be humiliated, but in a controlled way that kept the power with him. The heavy glass door clicked shut, muffling the jazz music to a dull, rhythmic throb. The cool, damp air hit Elena's bare shoulders, but she didn't shiver. Mark released her arm, shoving her slightly. "Who do you think you are?" he hissed, his face no longer needing to perform, contorting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "I'm your wife, Mark," Elena said, her voice surprisingly steady. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. "My wife. My wife is supportive. My wife is silent. My wife doesn't try to play CEO with Richard fucking Vance. You made me look like a fool, like I'm married to some social climbing whore." The word hung in the air, vile and sharp. Elena felt a coldness spread through her, a strange, clarifying calm. The fear she had lived with for years was evaporating, replaced by a brittle, hard certainty. "I was making conversation, Mark. He asked me a question." "He asked you a question?" Mark mocked, stepping into her space, forcing her to back up until her calves hit a large stone planter. He was several inches taller, and he used his height to loom, to intimidate. "And you just had to show him how smart you are, didn't you? You had to have your little moment. You can't just stand there and look beautiful. It's not enough for you." "It's not," she said. Mark stopped, thrown. He had expected tears, apologies, supplication. He had not expected resistance. "What did you say?" "It's not enough for me. Standing there, looking beautiful. It's not enough." You ungrateful." He was sputtering, the insults not coming fast enough to match his fury. "I gave you all of this. This life. This respect. You were nothing, a boring little girl in a dusty museum. I put you in Forbes. I put you in this dress. You put me in a cage, Mark." That was it. The final, unforgivable word of defiance. His face went from red to a blotchy pale white. "You." He didn't plan it. It was pure reptilian impulse. His hand, the one wearing his heavy gold signet ring, flew up. Elena saw it coming, but she didn't flinch. She stood her ground. The sound of his open palm cracking against her cheek was sharp and ugly, like a dry branch snapping. It was so loud it seemed to cut through the glass. Inside the ballroom, the conversations near the window stopped. Elena could see them. Amelia Davenport's hand flew to her mouth. Richard Vance, who had been watching, took a half step toward the door, his face dark. Elena's head snapped to the side from the force. A searing white-hot pain exploded from her cheekbone to her ear. Her eyes watered instantly, a purely physical reaction, but she did not cry. Silence. The only sound was the distant city traffic far below. Mark froze, his hands still half raised. He stared at her, breathing hard. He was looking at the woman he had just struck, but he was also looking past her at the horrified faces in the ballroom. He had, in 1 second of lost control, broken the cardinal rule. He hadn't just been a monster in private. He had been a monster in public. "Elena!" He stammered, his rage instantly replaced by a slithering, desperate panic. I didn't. You made me. You pushed me." Elena slowly turned her head back to face him. Her cheek was already blooming a shocking dark red. A tiny trickle of blood where his ring had cut her ran from the corner of her mouth. She said nothing. She just looked at him. And in her eyes he didn't see fear. He didn't see pain. He saw pity. And it was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. "This!" he snarled, grabbing her arm, trying to regain control to salvage the unsalvageable. "This is what you get. This is what you asked for. We're leaving. Now." He began to drag her toward the door. The guests inside recoiled as he fumbled for the handle, his public smile a grotesque frozen grimace. "No," Elena said. It was quiet, but it was absolute. "What?" He yanked her arm. "Get in the damn car." "No." She planted her feet. She pulled her arm from his grasp, a sudden, sharp movement that shocked him with its strength. "You're making a scene, Elena," he hissed, his eyes darting frantically at the audience inside. "Stop it." "You already made the scene, Mark," she said, and for the first time that night she smiled. It was a cold, broken, terrible smile. "You're done." "I am not." Mark's words were cut off by a new sound. It wasn't the jazz music, and it wasn't the party chatter. It was the sound of the main ballroom doors. The grand 30-foot-high oak doors at the far end of the room swinging open with a heavy, ominous thud. The party, already reeling from the silent drama on the terrace, went completely, utterly silent. The quartet stopped playing, a violin note dying with a squeak. Mark, his hand still on Elena's arm, turned his head. His blood ran cold. It wasn't hotel staff. It wasn't more guests. It was 2 uniformed police officers from the LAPD. And walking between them, his face a mask of thunder, was her father, Arthur Hayes. Time, which had snapped forward with the violence of the slap, now seemed to congeal. The entire ballroom, all 300 guests, became a frozen tableau. 300 pairs of eyes, which had been darting between Mark and Elena on the terrace, now swiveled as one to the grand entrance. Arthur Hayes did not look like he was attending a gala. He was in a dark, impeccably tailored business suit, not a tuxedo. He looked like a general arriving to survey a battlefield. The 2 uniformed officers flanking him were grim and professional. But it was the man behind them, a man in a rumpled trench coat with a weary, intelligent face, who made the air in the room crackle. This was Detective Miller of the LAPD's Financial Crimes Division. Mark's mind, a finely tuned instrument for calculating profit and loss, went into a tailspin. He processed the information with lightning speed, and he came to the only logical, self-absorbed conclusion. Elena called him. He looked at Elena, at the blood on her lip and the raging red mark on her cheek. He looked at her father, whose eyes were fixed on that mark with a murderous intensity. He looked at the police. They're here for this. For the slap, assault, domestic violence. Arthur is trying to ruin me. He's making a public spectacle. A surge of adrenaline, part panic, part defensive rage flooded his system. He could spin this. It was a private matter, a hysterical wife, an overbearing father-in-law. He would counter-sue for defamation. He let go of Elena's arm and shoved the terrace door open, stepping back into the ballroom. The sudden rush of warm air and the smell of champagne was nauseating. He held his hands up, palms out, in a gesture of placating, reasonable charm. "Arthur," he boomed, his voice echoing in the dead silence. "What is the meaning of this? You are interrupting my event. If Elena has been making accusations, I assure you it is a private family matter." Arthur Hayes did not stop walking. His pace was steady, measured. The three officers walked with him. They didn't look at the crowd. They didn't look at the champagne. They looked at only one man. They moved past the tables, past the shocked pale face of Amelia Davenport, past the calculating cold stare of Richard Vance. Elena stepped out of the terrace behind her husband. She didn't wipe the blood from her lip. She stood there, a silent, damning witness. "A private matter, Mark." Arthur's voice was low, but it carried across the entire vast room. It was a voice accustomed to commanding boardrooms, and it was vibrating with a rage so profound it was almost calm. "I believe it stopped being a private matter when you put your hands on my daughter." Mark let out a short, scoffing laugh. It sounded high-pitched and mad. "Oh, please, a small disagreement. She's emotional. You know how she gets. You can't just call the police." He turned to the detective, his charm turning oily and condescending. "Officer Detective, whatever this is a gross overreach. I am Mark Landon. This is my party. This is a family dispute. I demand you leave, or I will have my lawyers." "Mr. Mark Landon," Detective Miller interrupted. His voice was flat, bored, and utterly unimpressed. He had clearly dealt with 100 men like Mark. He held up a small leather badge holder. "Detective Miller, LAPD, Financial Crimes." Mark stopped. His mouth remained half open. The words did not compute. Financial. Crimes. Not domestic. Not assault. I don't understand," Mark stammered. This wasn't the script. His brain was scrambling, trying to find the new narrative. "Financial? What is this? A mistake." "No mistake, Mr. Landon," Miller said. He was now standing directly in front of Mark, who for the first time in his life seemed small. The two uniformed officers moved with practiced, fluid ease to stand on either side of him, cutting off any escape. Mark looked past them, his eyes wide and panicked, searching for Elena. She was standing by the terrace door, her expression unreadable. "Elena," he said, his voice a pleading whine. "What is this? Tell your father to call them off. It was a mistake. The audit, it's just paperwork." Elena said nothing. Arthur Hayes stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with the detective. He was looking at Mark, but he spoke to his daughter. "He thought the audit was the end of it, Elena. He thought it was just my accountants." "Mr. Landon," Detective Miller said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat. "The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, in conjunction with the Securities and Exchange Commission, has issued a warrant for your arrest." Mark's blood, which had run cold, now seemed to evaporate entirely. SEC. This wasn't Arthur. This wasn't a family squabble. This was the federal government. "A warrant for what?" he whispered. The room was so quiet the entire guest list could hear his voice crack. "For the slap," he asked, a last desperate, insane plea. Detective Miller almost smiled. "No, Mr. Landon. Not for the slap." "Mark Landon," Detective Miller said, his voice ringing with the formal, terrible finality of the law. "You are under arrest on 6 counts of felony wire fraud, 3 counts of embezzlement, 2 counts of securities fraud, and 1 count of money laundering." The list of charges hung in the air, a litany of ruin. Each word was a nail in Mark's coffin. Mark stared, his face a perfect blank mask of incomprehension. The fight-or-flight mechanism in his brain had simply short-circuited. He couldn't process the information. "Embezzlement," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "From who? Landon Corp is my company. You can't embezzle from yourself." "That's the funny thing about your company, Mark," Arthur Hayes said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You built it on a foundation of stolen capital. My capital." Mark's head snapped toward his father-in-law. "That's a lie. Hayes Holdings is a partner. We have an agreement." "We had an agreement," Arthur corrected. "An agreement you violated every single day for 3 years. The audit I initiated was just the tip of the iceberg. A very, very large iceberg." Arthur looked at the crowd, then at Detective Miller as if asking for permission. Miller nodded. This was part of the plan. The public humiliation was part of the justice. "For those of you who donated to the Hayes Foundation tonight," Arthur announced to the room, "I thank you for your generosity, and I promise you Hayes Holdings will be refunding every single dollar. Because it turns out," he said, turning his lethal gaze back to Mark, "not 1 cent of your money or the $50 million I seeded the foundation with ever went to a single charitable cause." A collective gasp swept the room. Amelia Davenport looked as if she might faint. Richard Vance just watched, his expression one of grim, vindicated understanding. "It all went here," Arthur continued. He nodded to Detective Miller, who pulled a small card from his pocket. "A shell corporation, Landon Global Initiatives, registered in the Cayman Islands." Miller read, which then funneled the money to a private numbered bank account at Gotthard Bank in Zurich, an account held solely in the name of Mr. Mark Landon. Mark started to shake. It began in his hands and spread to his knees. No, that's creative accounting. It's asset management. It's legal. It's theft, Mark," Arthur said. "You used my daughter to gain my trust. You used my name to build your company. And then you bled my family's legacy dry, laundering the money you stole from my company through the charity that bore my name. You, sir, are nothing but a common vulgar thief. You can't prove that." Mark hissed, his eyes darting for an exit for a lawyer, for anyone. "Oh, but we can," Arthur said. "You see, you're a very smart man, Mark. You covered your digital tracks well, but you got arrogant. You thought the one person who saw everything was too stupid, too broken, and too terrified to ever do anything about it." A terrible, dawning comprehension began to spread across Mark's face. He turned his head slowly, mechanically, to look at his wife. Elena was still standing by the terrace door. She hadn't moved. The red mark on her face was a flag of war. She met his gaze. "You?" he whispered. "Me," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting across the ballroom. She reached into her tiny beaded clutch and pulled out the small silver USB drive. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger for the entire room to see. "You left your laptop open, Mark," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "You thought I was just shopping online. You thought I was too naive to understand your spreadsheets. But I understand numbers. And I understand patterns." She tossed the USB drive to Detective Miller, who caught it neatly. "That's a decoy, of course," she said. "The real files have been with my father, a forensic accounting team, and the SEC for the last 2 months." The truth landed. It wasn't just the slap. It wasn't just her father's anger. This was her. She had done this. This was a long, cold, calculated plan. For months, while she had been playing the part of the perfect submissive wife, she had been systematically, meticulously, and brilliantly destroying him. The gala wasn't his coronation. It was her trap. She had let him walk onto that stage, let him deliver his speech full of lies about integrity and trust, knowing that every word was a lie and knowing that the police were on their way. She had waited until his arrogance was at its absolute peak, until he was surrounded by everyone he wanted to impress. The slap. The slap wasn't the reason for his downfall. It was just the punctuation. It was the final satisfying public proof of the monster she had already defeated. "Elena, no," Mark pleaded, his voice breaking all the arrogance and rage gone replaced by the pathetic whine of a child. "Please. You can't. It's me. It's your husband. We can fix this. I'll give the money back. Please. Don't do this." "Mr. Landon," Detective Miller said, pulling out a pair of steel handcuffs. "You need to put your hands behind your back." And that's when it happened. It wasn't a dramatic theatrical fall. It was a subsidence. The strings that had held Mark Landon upright, his arrogance, his charm, his belief in his own invincibility were all cut at once. His face, which had been a mask of panic, went slack. His eyes rolled back for a half second. His knees, which had been shaking, simply unlocked. He didn't crash to the floor. He collapsed. He folded in on himself, a hollow suit, his body sagging as if his bones had turned to liquid. He let out a strange, high-pitched "ah" sound, a noise of pure primal despair. He crumpled, catching himself on the edge of the very table where he and Elena were supposed to have celebrated his triumph. His hands, which had grabbed for the table to stop his fall, missed, and he slid ungracefully to the priceless Persian rug, landing in a heap of expensive tuxedo and ruined ambition. He was not unconscious. He was just broken. The two uniformed officers didn't miss a beat. They were on him instantly, hauling him up by his armpits, his legs dragging uselessly. He was sobbing now, not with rage, but with the full, racking, ugly sobs of complete and total self-pity. "No, no, no, you can't. You don't understand. She trapped me," he wailed, his voice muffled against his own chest. "She trapped me. It was her. She's the snake, Elena, you bitch. You ruined me." "You have the right to remain silent," one of the officers said, his voice a bored monotone as he expertly clicked the handcuffs around Mark's wrists. The sharp metallic snick of the cuffs locking was the loudest sound in the room. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The officers began to walk him out, half dragging, half carrying the sobbing, collapsing man. He was no longer Mark Landon, the Titan. He was just a criminal, weeping for himself. He twisted his head, his face a mess of tears and spittle, for one last look at his wife. "I loved you," he screamed. "I gave you everything." Elena watched him, her hand unconsciously rising to touch her stinging, throbbing cheek. The mark he had left there was the only answer she needed. Arthur Hayes walked over to his daughter, his eyes never leaving Mark's retreating form until the grand oak doors swung shut behind him and his captors. The silence that remained was heavy, thick, and absolute. Then Arthur turned to Elena. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and at the bloody, violent mark on her beautiful face. His own face, which had been so hard, so full of righteous fury, crumpled. The rage was gone, replaced by a father's profound, agonizing grief. He gently, his hand trembling, reached out and cupped her face, his thumb brushing near the wound. "Oh, my dear girl," he whispered, his voice cracking. He hurt you." It was only then, safe in her father's gaze, that Elena's perfect cold control finally broke. It wasn't a sob. It was a single shuddering breath, a gasp of air that she felt she hadn't taken in 5 years. A single tear traced a clean path through the drying blood on her cheek. "It's over, Daddy," she whispered. "It's finally over." "Yes, baby," he said, pulling her into his arms, his large hand protecting the back of her head as she buried her face in his suit jacket. "It's over. You're safe. You did it. You're free." The guests, forgotten, stood in stunned silence, witnesses to the fall of a king and the liberation of a queen. Richard Vance from across the room watched Elena and her father. He took a sip of his champagne, his expression unreadable, and then slowly, deliberately, he began to clap. It was a slow, solitary, respectful applause. One by one, others in the room, understanding what they had just seen, joined in. It wasn't for Mark, it was for her. The fall of Mark Landon wasn't just a party anecdote. It was an explosion that rocked the Los Angeles financial world. The headlines were brutal. Landon Corp CEO arrested for massive fraud. Titan to terror, the Landon Foundation scandal. Wife's USB drive brings down empire. The legal battle was as Mark had promised in his rage's epic. He hired the most expensive, ruthless lawyers in the state. They tried every defense. They claimed Mark was a victim of a hostile takeover by Arthur Hayes. They claimed the data was fabricated by a vengeful, unstable wife. They painted Elena as a cold, calculating black widow, a femme fatale who had married Mark for his money and then destroyed him when he tried to control her spending. It didn't work. Elena Hayes. She had dropped the Landon name the day after the gala was the prosecution's star witness. When she walked into the courtroom, she was not the pale, trembling woman from the party. She wore a simple dark blue suit, her hair pulled back in a severe professional bun. The only jewelry she wore was a simple pearl earring. The faint yellowish-green shadow of the bruise on her cheekbone was still visible under her light makeup, a permanent visible reminder of the truth. Mark's lawyer, a shark named Harrison, tried to destroy her on the stand. "Mrs. Hayes Landon, isn't it true you were furious your husband was cutting off your allowance?" "My name is Elena Hayes. And no, that's not true. I was furious he was stealing $50 million from a children's charity." "Isn't it true you fabricated this entire story, stole company data, and fed it to your father to win a divorce settlement?" "I provided evidence of multiple felonies to the authorities. The settlement I'm interested in is justice." "And this slap," Harrison said, sneering. "Isn't it true you provoked your husband, that you flaunted yourself in front of his business rivals, that you dared him to react?" Elena paused. The courtroom was silent. She looked at the jury, then at Harrison. "I spoke to Mr. Richard Vance about opera. My husband in response told me I was a whore, and then struck me across the face with his ring, cutting my lip open. Which part of that do you define as provoking?" Mark Landon, sitting at the defense table, his expensive suit now ill-fitting on his thinner, diminished frame, just stared at his hands. He was found guilty on all counts, the judge citing the callous and sociopathic nature of using a charity as a vehicle for theft, and factoring in the clear, credible testimony of spousal abuse as motive, sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison. The Landon Corp was dissolved. His assets were seized. The Davenports and the other investors, thanks to Arthur's intervention, were made whole. Richard Vance, whose deal with Mark had been voided, sent Elena a simple one-line email, "Well done." Life for Elena began again. She sold the glass and marble prison in the Palisades. The contents, the expensive cold furniture Mark had chosen, were all auctioned off, with the proceeds going to the new, legitimate Hayes Foundation. She moved into a bright, warm penthouse apartment in a downtown building. It was half the size, but for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. Her old friend Sarah Jenkins helped her decorate. They painted the walls warm colors. She began to collect art again, filling her home with the post-war sculptures she loved. She didn't hide. She didn't retreat. She took the role Mark had only pretended to have. Her father, with tears in his eyes, had offered her the presidency of the new Hayes Foundation. 6 months after the trial, Elena Hayes stood on a different kind of stage. It wasn't a ballroom, it was a community center in East LA, announcing the opening of a new shelter for victims of domestic abuse, specifically a shelter that provided financial, legal, and career counseling. She was not wearing a beaded, restrictive gown. She was in a sharp crimson pantsuit, a color of her own choosing. She stood at the podium looking out at the crowd of reporters, volunteers, and survivors. "Power," she said, her voice strong and clear, resonating with a new, hard-won authority, "is often mistaken for noise, for bluster, for control. But real power is not the cage. It's the key. It's the quiet, steady, and unbreakable decision to say no more. My name is Elena Hayes, and we are just getting started." She finished her speech, and this time the applause was real. It was warm. It was for her. She smiled a genuine, unguarded smile and walked off the stage not as an accessory but as the main event. Elena's story is a powerful reminder that the most polished surfaces can hide the most toxic secrets. Mark Landon built an empire on lies, but he made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the person sleeping right next to him. He mistook her silence for weakness and her grace for submission. He never realized that while he was busy building his prison, she was patiently forging the key. This story shows that true strength isn't about how loud you can shout or how hard you can hit. It's about the unbreakable will to fight for the truth even when you're terrified. Elena took her pain and turned it into a weapon for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone he had deceived. What did you think of Elena's incredible cold-nerved plan? What was the moment you knew Mark was truly finished? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more true-to-life dramas every single week. Thank you for listening.